Welcome back everyone to another Technique Coding programming tutorial. In this video, we are continuing with our iOS authentication handling series with a Django backend. Now, in this video, we will be creating the activation endpoint in our Django backend project. In the last video, we created the registration endpoint, but we didn't finish off because we have to have the activation endpoint available to us to create a send activation link email. The registration endpoint in the last one was good to go. It creates the user, it just didn't send the endpoint, the link out to the user. So let's get started. So if I go back into the project, what we have here is that registration endpoint, and we've got the few lines of code that actually send and check the activation email commented out. What we're going to need here first, though, is we have to create a utility file that has a few methods in it, because we can't really move forward without handling some token things and also handling sending the actual activation email out. So what we're going to do is we're going to create a new file, Python file called utils, that we're going to shove all this stuff into. And first thing we're going to do is we need to import some stuff as usual. For settings, we're going to, from django.core.mail, import send mail. From django.urls, import reverse. This is the thing that's actually going to create, that I mentioned in the last video, that's going to take a namespace and a endpoint name and then turn that into a URL for us to use. Also need from django.core.exceptions or validation error, django.contrib.auth, import get user model again. I talked about this before. This is just allows us an easier time getting the user model type from smtp lib port smtp exception. So if our email sending errors out, it's going to throw an smtp exception. Rest framework, simple JWT, port access dot tokens or access token from rest framework simple JWT dot exceptions token error. And then the one thing we need to do before everything else is we need to create a variation of this access token. Now, the goal of this utils file is to do a couple things. One is to actually create the function to send the activation email, and then there's three other functions we want. One, to get a token or get a user from an existing token. So these tokens will represent users. Basically, what a JWT does is it takes a username and password and it encrypts it into a long string, and then it sends it to the user. And then the user uses that to send to the backend, and then the backend will de-encrypt that using its own salts, encryption algorithms, what have you, to get that data to log the user in and handle things. Now, because these are stateless, aka there's no record on the database of these tokens. So in some other frameworks, you might be able to see, like in the database, that access token. And if you delete the access token from the database, then it revokes that token. This one doesn't do that. These are what's called stateless tokens, meaning they're not saved anywhere as far as on the database. They're just passed around and they're de-encrypted as needed for that information. However, we will be blacklisting them, which means that we can revoke these access tokens. And what that does is we basically create that database record I just mentioned and call it a blacklist. So if we want to revoke a token, we save it in the database as a listed token, and the next time, every time a client sends us a token to this backend, the simple JWT library will automatically check, hey, Does this token correspond to one that's in the blacklist? If it does, we're going to reject it. So in order to do that though, the simple JWT library does have something pretty nice, and that is a blacklistable mixin. So what we can do is we're going to create a new Python file called tokens. You can put this really wherever you want, but for this case, we're going to put it in tokens. I'm going to say from rest framework.simpleJWT.tokens import blacklist mixin and access token. Also, real quick, way back to the first video, we imported, if we scroll all the way to the top of the settings, this REST Framework Simple JWT Token Blacklist app. This is where all of that functionality comes from. So this doesn't just come out of the box. We actually had to import it using this app right here. Now, after this is done, we get all this nice blacklisting functionality. So if I go back to my tokens, we imported what we needed. So now we have to say class, say blacklistable access token, and it's going to subclass access token and blacklist mixin. And if you don't have anything to actually write inside the implementation of a class in Python, you just type pass, and that allows the system, or I should say the runtime, to say, hey, you know what? This is fine the way it is, so we just hit pass, so nothing's wrong here. We're just going to continue. So I go back into my utils. Now we can import that. So we say from this package in the tokens file, import that blacklistable access token. Okay, so we're going to run through this pretty quick here. Keep in mind that one of these things we still can't do until the activation endpoint is set, but what we're going to do is we're actually going to create that send activation email function for right now, since we're already in here. Send activation email. We're going to take a user object. Email is none. Then we can't actually do anything, so we're going to say return false. And this is OAuth token equals access token dot for user. This is what actually creates the string itself right here. This for user. It's associating it with the user, and it's also associating the, I believe, take a look at this in the back on your own time, but I believe it's taking the encrypted password to store in the token, not the raw password. If my hunch is correct, I don't know for sure, so check into that if you're curious. The next part is we're actually creating the link to send out in an email. And this is what's not set up yet, so we won't actually be able to use this quite yet. Settings.server base URL again. Reverse API user activation. Now this is in the last video I mentioned how inside our URLs, we are namespacing the file, the package of URLs in this app with API, and then we're naming them like registration. So what I'm doing here is I'm saying check the API namespace, which is our urls.py, for a endpoint named user activation. This doesn't exist yet, so that's why it's not going to work. We could say like registration. See how it auto-completed there? It knows, the system automatically knows that that is an endpoint. But what we want is user activation, which is not set up yet. Keyword args equals, type here, token OAuth token. Now Django has a nice way of actually including parameters in the URLs, so URL parameters, and that is by doing something like this. So this will be in the activation endpoint. That is why you see this keyword args right here, because we will be passing in a token into the keyword args, and this is how you do it. This passes in the token into that URL that's created from this method. Okay, so in order to send the email, all we really got to do is say try send mail. Now in here we have a from email. It's going to settings dot email host user, which is the actual user. The from email, I should say. The subject, we're just going to say activate account. Then we're going to say recipient list. Recipient list is that user.email that we checked for. Then we're going to say the message is blank, and I'm going to explain why here in a second. HTML message equals, and I'm just going to copy and paste this in here because I don't want to type all of it. Yeah, I know, another lazy YouTuber. But anyway, so this HTML message is, well, it's actual HTML. So your mail client will render this out as HTML. The message is a fallback. So if your client can't actually show HTML messages, it'll fall back on that message, or it should at least. And so we're just going to leave it in HTML message right now, just because I already have this link in there, and it's a little bit nicer to work with HTML rather than a raw message anyway, and it looks better. So the last thing we need to do is say fail silently equals false. We want this to fail and actually throw an exception if it does fail, so we know what's going on. This is where that SMTP exception comes in. Say print E, return false. This is probably going to be the one area that's going to fail for you guys the most, because this is highly dependent on whether or not you got your email settings correct. So if we go back down to the settings and I scroll all the way down to the email here, these settings do matter. And you might have to tinker with these a little bit in order to get it to work. The easiest case scenario is just rather than using these environment variables that I mentioned, is just hard code them in first to make sure they work, and then go on to the environment variables, because sometimes the environment variables, there might be a space in there. You might get frustrated because something couldn't be hooked up correctly. I would say hard code them in first, make sure they work, run it, and then put the environment variables in there after, if you are looking to throw this app into production. So, but from my experience, this send mail is probably going to be the most common area where you will have issues because of those email settings. Now, this is done. So it's not going to work because, again, that activation endpoint's not there. But let's move on. We're going to finish out this file. I'm just going to crank through this. The next thing we need is to be able to get a user from an existing token. We do that by using that access token class. So what this is doing right here is it's taking that encrypted token, and then inside this class, it's de-encrypting it and all that, or unencrypting it and all that stuff. And then it's giving us an actual access token object. So within that, we have a couple of nice, useful methods. User ID equals token user ID. This is how we can get that. Equals. Oh, I got to import the user model here. Actually, I could just do this. Turn the user. Also, every single Django model you will ever create automatically comes with this little does not exist error. It's going to complain to me because it's too vague of an exception. That's that. So what we're doing here is we are trying to parse the token. Off the top of my head, this might fail. So we have this exception here just as like a catch-all. You really want to be as specific as possible, but for this tutorial and the sake of time, I'm just wrapping everything under the exception, the broad exception here. But I am specifying this user model does not exist because we do want to tell ourselves at least whether or not there is like an unavailable user that this token represents. So next thing we want to do is revoke the token. And the nice thing is that because we imported that blacklist library and we have that class within the tokens right here, it gives us out of the box functionality to do this. So all we really have to do is say token equals blacklistable access token and create one from the one we already have. So it's going to unencrypt it, like I said before. And we just have to say token dot blacklist, and we're done. So this will automatically create a record in the database for that blacklist. Now we want to check to see if the token is valid. Again, because we have that blacklist class, blacklist token class, we have some out-of-the-box functionality that's really useful. It's going to make this method very, very short. Dot check expiration, then access token, dot check blacklist, and return true, and accept token error as E, return false. And of course, we're going to print it out just in case. And we're done with the utils file. Now we have everything we need to create that activation endpoint. So without going crazy here, I'm just going to go straight into it. And what we're going to do is we need to first, actually before we do anything else, we need to create a HTML file. So when the user taps on that activation link, they're going to be sent to a website. And that website is going to check the token, make sure it's still valid. And if it is valid, it's going to then check to see if the user exists. And if it does, it's going to activate the user, and it's going to respond with sending the user to a web page that just says, user is activated. Or that web page can also say there was an error and here's why. Now, with mobile apps, you can get into deep linking, which means if they click on that link, instead, the app can handle it and then send a mobile request out to the activate endpoint. Well, it would be a different endpoint. And then everything would be handled in the app. We're not going to do that here for the sake of time. Deep linking is a whole nother topic in itself that I'll go over in a future class. But first thing we need to do is we have to create a new directory called templates. Now, this is a Django pattern that we have here. If you create an app, each app should have its own templates directory. Inside that directory, we're going to create another directory called API. I know it can be kind of weird. And then we're going to create our HTML file and name it count activation HTML. Now, kind of behind the scenes, what's happening is Django will take all of the apps that it has, so API, or if you have an auth one, or if you have an admin one, or whatever, and then it's going to take all of the template directories, combine them into one template directory, and then have anything that's within each one just in the same directory. So that's why we have to kind of put the templates and APIs and all this stuff in here. Also, out of the box, it is configured this way out of the box to work like this. You can change it. You can actually have all of these templates in one directory outside of a Django app, but we're not going to go over that right now. Just know that it is possible. Nice thing about PyCharm too is we can actually mark this as a template folder, so PyCharm recognizes it. I haven't really noticed any real difference by doing so other than the color changes, and it's just easier to see. But in any case, if you're unfamiliar with how Django does things, they have their own template language where we can where we can import variables, have control statements such as if, else, for loops and stuff. But in any case, let's finish this up. Count activation for the title. Inside the body, we're going to do if failed reason. So each template, when you create one, it's going to have a context. Inside that context object, we can actually set properties and parameters on it. So we will be creating a string called failed reason. Now, this if statement will check whether or not this exists, or if it's a Boolean, or if it is any of those kind of soft Boolean conversions that Python can check. In this case, we're going to use this if statement, and it's going to be true if it exists and false if it doesn't exist, in our case. So if there was a failed reason, we're going to say failed reason. Now, this is just the syntax to use a context variable within a Django template here. Cool. There's a lot more to learn about Django templates. I'll leave that to the viewer, but just know that this is the way we can handle some of these errors. It goes way more in depth than this, but we're going to leave this for right now. So if there is a failed reason, it's going to list out the failed reason in HTML. If there is not a failed reason, then it's successful, and we're going to tell the user that the account was activated. So now what we can do is we can come back into our view here, and we can say, first off, we have to actually import one more thing here, and that's going to be a template view. From Django.views.generic import template view. Oh, a couple other things too we have to import. We also have to import a lot of those utils. From this package, import utils. So, class activate account, and it's gonna subclass the template view. Now, this is not a Django Rest Framework view, and because of that, this is not secured. So we don't actually have to say allow any, because we are not subclassing a Django Rest Framework view. We are subclassing a Django view at this time. Name API/account activation.html, and then from here we can start the actual request. So define get like this. This request object also is not the same as the Django Rest Framework's request object that we saw in here. Just a quick note. What we're going to do, context. So here's that context I mentioned a little bit earlier. Data, as in the keyword args. So this context, we say self.get context data by using the actual template views implementation of it. So anything that Django has out of the box that's needed for the view context that we made for the HTML, we're just capturing it here, and then we're just going to add to it. Token equals keyword args dot get token done. If token is none, or not utils dot is token valid, what we're going to do is we're going to say context response, give context. Okay, so what we did was we checked to see if the token is actually none. If it doesn't exist in the keyword args, then what we're going to do is also the other way we can do this too, since this is a list, you can just do token like that, and that's also fine. For the sake of clarity, I'm just going to leave it just like this though. So what's going on here is we're checking to see if the token is none, and then what we're doing is we're double checking to see if the token is valid, and if not, we are setting a parameter on that context or property on that context called failed reason to match what we actually have in the HTML, and we're just saying token is invalid or missing. And then this is pre-built into the template context or template view class, just rendered to response and the context. And what it's going to do is it's going to automatically take this file, it's going to render it so it's viewable within a browser into HTML, and then while it's rendering it, it's going to use the context to render that. Now we're going to fetch the user. Just like that. Does. Context. Okay. So what we're doing here is we're just getting a handle on the user object, and then we're handling any error that comes about for that. So we want to get the user from the token, and then we want to revoke that token. So if this is successful, then we'll be able to do what we need to do and activate the user. But we want those activation tokens to be one-offs. So in order to do that, we have to blacklist them. And that's why we are revoking the token here. And then we just handle an error the exact same way as we handled it above. And then from here on out, we are good to go. So we can just do user.isActive equals true. And then we have to save it, because it's not automatically persistent if you just set the property on the user. We actually have to explicitly save it. Then we can do return self.render to response and context. And because if we got here, we didn't set a failed reason on the context, so it's going to default to that failed reason property not being there, and it's just going to say you are active. Now, one last thing, since we're already here, is let's go ahead and just sneak into this video that a really quick secure endpoint. So this endpoint will be what the app actually, after the app's logged in, has an access token, they'll be able to hit this endpoint to just get a string. This will be a secure endpoint. So, but we don't need to go crazy here, so we can just do find get request data equals logged in. And now we're gonna just do we're just gonna return a quick JSON response here. So I'm gonna say from Django.http.response or JSON response. Again, because this is Django Rest Framework, you can use something called a serializer, but it's outside of the scope of this. What we just want to do is just a real quick send this back. So we're going to say return JSON response data safe equals false, status equals status.200. Okay. This safe false, I've noticed that if this is not there, the actual payload sent back has like an extra character or something. So for this tutorial, we're just going to set this to safe. In production, you're probably not going to want that. and you're probably going to want to just use serializers that, which is how the Django Rest Framework usually should be used anyway. So we now have an actual endpoint that we can use to ping with an access token. So now that that's all in place, we have to add these again to our URLs file. So we're going to go back into our URLs. We're going to add these things. So we're going to say path date account / it's a string. So we're going to add the token to the actual path. And to do that, we are declaring a path variable or parameter, if you will. And Django has a couple of these. This can be a string. I think it could also be a slug and a couple other things as well. And the name of that is token. And the only reason the name is here is so we can use that reverse that you saw in the send activation email right here to, if we wanted to create a string from this, we have to be able to reference that parameter in some way, and that's how you do it. Token, same thing as this token. So we've named it in that way. Now we have to say views.activateAccount.asView, and we have to name this. And this has to be the same name as what we're referencing here. So I'll just copy it. And we're good to go. Now, we can actually finish off this entire thing right now. And what we're going to do in order to do that is we have to also add the path login. I should say login data. Use.login_data_API.asView. Now, because we're not referencing this anywhere else, we don't actually have to add the name here, so I'm not going to add that. There is one other thing we have to do, and that is we need endpoints to fetch the access token. Because the access token is being created by the third-party library, the simple JWT, the simple JWT library actually has views we can add to this path, add these URL parameters out of the box. So we're going to use those. Another reason why I suggest that people use a library for this rather than actually running their own or implementing their own. It's so much easier. Plus you get these nice things out of the box. I haven't mentioned token refreshing here. I'm going to mention it in a second. Path /token obtain pair as view. We don't need to name these because the app is the only thing that will hit these endpoints and use these endpoints, so I don't actually have to name them. Generally speaking, you only want to name them if you're going to be using them within Django somewhere else. So we don't technically need the registration one here either, but I'm going to leave it there. Okay, so now we can hit a token endpoint, and this is what the user is going to use to send. They're going to send their username and password to this endpoint that's highlighted, and this endpoint is going to return a JWT with an access token and a refresh token. If the access token expires and the refresh token is still valid, then we can hit this endpoint with the refresh token as the payload to return us a new JWT with a new access token and a new refresh token. So we are all set here. So what we can do is, well, we can actually go ahead and test this. Oh, one thing before I do that, we are going to want to go back into our registration endpoint and uncomment the code that actually sends the email out. And we should be good. Okay, so from here on out, we're going to just refresh Django here just to make sure that it's good to go. It is. So we can test this. Let me go into the library into our admin site real quick here. And just delete this user. Yep, I'm sure, delete it. Now I am going to Postman and use an actual email here. Okay, so I just received the email, but before I handle that email out, let's go back into the Django admin site and just see what we have. So we're going to refresh the page. We're going to click on our new user that was created using the endpoint. And then we're going to see down here at the very bottom that the active flag is clicked off. So now what we're going to do is I'm going to copy the link that I received. And here's that link. I'm going to copy it. Copy link. I'm going to go into a new tab. I'm going to paste it in. I'm going to hit enter. And we can see the account was activated. So if I go back into the admin site, which is right here, and then I refresh the page on that user, see that it's active. So what's nice is now that we have all that set up, we can come back into Postman right here, and we can go to the get access token area, and we can send a request to fetch an access token. So when I hit send, we actually get the payload that we're looking for. We have an access token, big long string that's encrypted, and we have a refresh token in case we ever want to fetch another one. Now for the endpoints, that login data endpoint that we have there, we can use that authorization token, or the JWT token, and we can create a header named authorization, and the value is going to be bearer space in between the two, and then you paste that long access token that you saw right here. I have Postman set up so it's automatically setting all these things for me, but just know that's how you do it, is you create a header in the request, and then you say bearer space, give it the access token. So if I send this request out, it's going to give me an issue here. And it's going to say that the URL is found. I bet you that I named it wrong. I did. Login data. Login data. Fetch it. There. Now I'm logged in. So this is the payload that was sent back, just JSON, and I am now logged in. So that is it. That's the entire backend. I know it was a couple long videos, but it really doesn't take too much if you know like what libraries you want to use, how to set it up, and we're done. The one thing that we could do is we could actually utilize that refresh token endpoint here, but I'll leave that as an exercise for the viewer for that. But that's it. So these last few videos, we just went over how to make this entire backend. Really, like learning Django's in Python is probably the hardest part about this whole thing. And then obviously knowing what libraries to use. I mean, it is a lot of information to compile, but if you look at it, it's really not that much code itself. As long as those libraries exist, like you know how to use the Django Rest Framework, and you can find libraries like the JWT, the simple JWT library, and know how they interact, you can create a backend pretty quickly. So in the next video, what we're gonna do is I might make a video on setting up the Gmail for this app. But what I think I'm going to do is I'm going to hold off on that, and we're going to go straight into the iOS side. So it's starting to get really exciting here, and I hope everyone is pretty amped up. But all right, I'll leave it at that, and I'll see you in the next one. Happy coding.